I just bought a new house for $190,000. As she said this, Julia looked at me with a grin. Despite it being my mother's funeral, she arrived late and came wearing a bright red dress with a slit up to her thigh. The relatives were all appalled by Julia's incredible insensitivity, but Mike, standing next to her, just smiled cheerfully. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at the atmosphere around me and Julia's behavior. I'll give you that bank book. My condolences. Mother-in-law, are you being a sore loser? With 1.3 billion, I can live without working and not have to grovel to you, which feels refreshing. Julia's words made me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. Seeing me laugh like that, Julia finally started to feel that something was off. So I decided to tell her the truth. That bank book you have, you can't withdraw money from it anymore. At those words, Julia and Mike seemed unable to understand the situation. Now, it's time for a counterattack. My name is Emily. I am a 56-year-old housewife. People have always said that I'm so laid back that I wouldn't notice a fraud right in front of me, but I don't think that's true about myself. My husband John and I had an arranged marriage. I heard that my mother, who liked him working in our company, arranged a meeting with him as a prospective successor. John is a very calm person who treasures me. People often say they can't believe we had an arranged marriage because even after 34 years, John and I still close and often go out holding hands. John and I have one child who has just turned 33. We didn't decide against having a second one, but we chose not to because our eldest son, Mike, was quite a handful. Mike could hardly be called serious. He barely graduated from university and soon quit the local company he worked for, hopping from job to job. On top of that, he was spendthrift and never contributed to the household expenses while living at home. It was 2 years ago that such a Mike got married. He suddenly woke us up in the middle of the night saying, "I found someone I want to marry." Although we didn't oppose him, thinking that this might settle him down a bit, the appearance of the woman who showed up later at the meeting place left me and John speechless. "Hello, my name is Julia. Nice to meet you." Julia, the wife of our eldest son, appeared swinging her flashy long golden hair, wearing a short dress with a large open back. John and I couldn't even look directly at her, as the dress seemed to reveal her underwear just by sitting down. "This is my girl. We just got registered yesterday." "That's right. Oh, by the way, I'm 8 weeks pregnant. Please celebrate with us." We were surprised by Mike's words, but even more so by Julia's, which made us exclaim in shock. The reason they had to marry so suddenly was because they were having a child. "Mike, why didn't you tell us such important news?" "Huh? What difference would it make if I told you?" "Oh, right, I have no money, so Mom, please take care of the birth expenses." Faced with one revelation after another, I couldn't keep up. But John was calm and held my hand to soothe me. Then he turned to Mike and opened his mouth. "Hey, you got someone else's daughter pregnant without being able to take responsibility?" "Huh? That's why I married her, didn't I?" Mike responded irritably to John's valid point. "I think that just getting married doesn't mean you've taken responsibility." John seemed to agree with my thoughts and immediately retorted to Mike. "You don't have money or a place to live. What responsibility are you talking about? You can't leave just by getting registered. You said Julia, right? Since you're already registered, I won't oppose the marriage now. Aren't your parents here today? I'm disowned by my parents, so I haven't told them about the marriage or the pregnancy. John and I were so shocked by this that we were rendered speechless. Mike, picking up on the atmosphere, clicked his tongue and stood up. So, you're saying we should just drop dead with our baby? That's not what I'm saying. If you're going to be a parent, I want you to be responsible. Julia, for now, we'll take care of you until the baby is born. Fortunately, we have spare rooms and there's a housekeeper. We can offer that much help. However, the conditions are that Mike must earn enough to cover the birth expenses, prepare for a new home, and the living expenses after moving. And Julia, you need to contact your parents. Mike and Julia reluctantly agreed to John's conditions. Julia promptly contacted her parents, and soon enough, Julia's father got in touch with John, and they managed to arrange a meeting. Julia's parents turned out to be very kind people. Although Julia claimed she was disowned, her parents say that they had no recollection of such a thing. It was said that Julia had been meddling with a married couple in the neighborhood and had an affair with her husband. She had been working in the nightlife business since then, and no matter how much her parents tried to persuade her, she never listened, and one day disappeared suddenly. We told Mike about this, but he refused to believe it. To make matters worse, he proudly said, "Julia is beautiful after all," which gave me a headache. Since moving into our house, Julia has done nothing. She would sleep until noon, and upon waking up, she'd eat the food prepared by the housekeeper and then go back to her room. On the rare occasion she spoke to me, it was to ask for money to buy things for the baby. And if I refused, she would complain to Mike about all sorts of things, and somehow I would end up being scolded by Mike. However, perhaps because she was sternly spoken to at first, she never showed such an attitude in front of John. When I talked to John about it, he tried to spend as much time with her as possible on weekends. However, it's difficult on weekdays because of work. Julia took advantage of those times to continue getting money from me. Even after Julia gave birth, Mike kept making excuses for not deciding on a new home. I ran out of patience and gave him information on new homes, but he kept rejecting them, saying the rooms were too small or the location was bad. Mike, how long do you plan to stay here? Haven't you found a new home yet? I'm looking okay. We're family, so it should be fine. Or are you saying you want us to live in a shabby place and suffer? No matter how selfish Mike and Julia are, the grandchild is dear to us. We want to avoid our grandchild having to struggle as much as possible. Realizing this, Mike and Julia started to use the grandchild as leverage whenever something came up. Because of this, we found ourselves unable to speak firmly. Then I got a call from the company that my mother had collapsed. At the hospital, the doctor said tonight would be critical, and John and I stayed with my mother the whole time. I called Mike, but he didn't answer. We kept calling alternatively, but Mike didn't answer the phone until the next morning. What were you doing? We called so many times. Grandma wanted to see you one last time. Sorry about that. We were just out, right? With Mike's words, Julia smiled and nodded. Yeah. Both John and I could only tremble with the grief of losing my mother and anger towards Mike and Julia. The funeral is the day after tomorrow, huh? We don't have any mourning clothes, so prepare them for us. Saying that, Mike left the hospital room with Julia without even looking at my mother. I'm sorry, it must be my fault for the way I raised him. It's not your fault. He's the one to blame. It's sad for the grandchild, but it won't help those two if it continues like this. Isn't it time we made a decision? I agreed with my husband and made up my mind. After arranging everything for my mother's funeral, when I returned home, only the housekeeper and the grandchild were there. It turns out they hadn't come back since leaving their child with us the night before last. I made a phone call to a certain place and had some documents sent over. Then I went to my mother's house, and it was clear that someone had been searching for something. I looked inside a drawer and immediately realized what was missing. It was my mother's frequently used bank book and seal. I quickly contacted John. John immediately went to the bank and had the account frozen. Due to my mother's carelessness in noting down the PIN in the passbook, about $90,000 had already been used, but it was a trivial amount considering the total. Mike and Julia didn't show up for the wake, and they hadn't returned by the following morning. For now, we prepared a suite for two and left the house after asking the housekeeper to look after our grandchild. Inside my bag were documents with the date and time of the withdrawal from my mother's account and documents considering our grandchild's future. We still couldn't get in touch with Mike and Julia, but everything was ready in case they showed up. I took a deep breath. Even as the funeral began, Mike and Julia did not appear. Could it be that they intend not to attend their grandmother's funeral at all? The sheer absurdity of the situation made me feel dizzy. At that moment, the entrance of the venue started to buzz. The crowd that had been huddled together split to the left and right. Walking through them and into the venue were Mike and Julia. When they found us, they waved my mother's bank book in front of us. Then, an inappropriately cheerful voice echoed in the venue. I just bought a new house for $190,000. As she said this, Julia looked at me with a grin. Despite it being my mother's funeral, she arrived late and came wearing a bright red dress with a slit up to her thigh. The relatives were all appalled by Julia's incredible insensitivity, but Mike, standing next to her, just smiled contentedly. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at the atmosphere around me and Julia's behavior. I'll give you that bank book. My condolences. Mother-in-law, are you being a sore loser? With $8,600,000, I can live without working and not to have girl to you, which feels refreshing. Julia's words made me laugh so much that my stomach hurt. Seeing me laugh like that, Julia finally started to feel that something was off. So I decided to tell her the truth. That bank book you have, you can't withdraw money from it anymore. Julia and Mike seemed unable to understand the situation. Now it's time to start the counterattack. You see, that account was frozen yesterday. Frozen? What do you mean? I was able to withdraw money just fine yesterday. Julia snapped at me, not understanding the meaning of the words. I took out some documents from my bag and showed them to Julia. Julia still didn't understand, but Mike, who had once worked at a bank, seemed to catch on quickly. No, that's a lie. Hey, this is a problem. Why was it frozen so quickly? Unfreeze it, please. It won't be unfrozen until the inheritance procedures are completed. You know that, don't you? It won't be for at least another 3 months, right? That's impossible, he said and collapsed. Julia, sensing trouble, looked at us pleadingly. Mother-in-law, we don't have any money. You can't live like this. Oh, didn't you just withdraw $19,000 2 days ago? When I pointed that out, Julia's face turned bright red and she trembled. Then finally, she burst into tears and yelled at me. That money is already spent. Just buying dresses, suits, and accessories almost finished it off. Why? That's our money. Give it back. Your money? That's strange. That money was supposed to be inherited by my wife, wasn't it? Julia looked at me with a triumphant face for some reason. Then she put her hands on her hips and burst into loud laughter. That will has already been thrown away. After giving that secretary a little treat, he would do anything I said. I had him rewrite the will to leave everything to Mike, so that money belongs to Mike. Julia kept giggling, but she noticed John wasn't losing his smile and looked at us suspiciously. Then John started laughing out loud. Too bad. He resigned yesterday. And about the will, unfortunately, the one he threw away was a fake. The real will has been in my safe deposit box. Then John pulled out a cylindrical holder from his bag, unfolded the paper inside, and began to read. Any amendments made after this will are to be considered fraudulent and must be destroyed immediately. All assets are to be bequeathed to my beloved daughter Emily. Should anything happen to Emily, the person who takes over the company will inherit. However, my grandson, Mike, may inherit up to $19,000, but it's at Emily's discretion. What? Mike? You don't have inheritance rights? Only $19,000 and that's already spent. What do you mean? I got pregnant because you said we were going to receive an inheritance in the millions. I was astounded to learn that the reason for their rushed marriage was such. Mike was holding his head, shocked that his grandmother had left such a will. I glared at Julia with gratitude for my mother's love. The $19,000 is the amount I decide whether to inherit, right? I have no intention of letting it go just because you two spent it recklessly. But I can't pay it back because we already spent it. And the house, we bought it in cash. We were supposed to pay tomorrow. At least let us have that. I brushed off Julia, who was clutching at my clothes, begging, and looked down at her. When I sneered through my nose, Julia's face turned pale. As soon as the funeral is over, move out of the house. We prepared a place for you as a farewell gift. You can leave if you both work. The next paper John presented was a flyer for a rental property over 30 years old, costing $330 a month. Mike looked as if he had seen the unbelievable. You're joking, Dad. You're telling us to live in that dump? I can't work, and I don't want to live in such a dirty place. Looking down on the two as they made such remarks, I voiced my next counterattack. Oh, that's right. Please sign this. What's this, Mom? Are you trying to disown me? Julia hurriedly peered at the document, her face turning pale as she looked up again. What does this mean? Adoption of a daughter? That child is my child. And Mike is renouncing his inheritance. It's just as it's written there. Have you two ever cared for your child until now? You left her with the housekeeper on a whim and never once thought about whether your daughter was alright, did you? You're adults now. You can live on your own, but it's different for the child. I'll raise her properly. As I declared this, Julia's face was ashen. Then, as the final blow, I showed them a certain document. This is a record of your housekeeper's work. Looking at this, I couldn't believe that you were properly taking care of the child. No, that must be because the housekeeper... The housekeeper? Someone who has been working faithfully for us for 20 years. I trust her more. Julia was speechless and frozen. Then, prompted by John, Mike signed all the documents, and just as the funeral staff came to the call for the departure, we bid farewell to the two. After the cremation, when we returned home, Julia's parents had come to visit. They asked to offer incense, and as I was serving them tea, "Mom, help me please. We're being bullied by my mother-in-law and have to leave this house. She's taking my daughter away." Julia, who had come to collect her belongings, burst into the living room and screamed. Julia's mother glanced at her daughter and sipped her tea as if nothing had happened. "What, Mom? Hey, Dad, you know I hate suffering and hardship, right? You'll help me, won't you?" Even though Julia clung to her father, he, like her mother, merely glanced at her and then started drinking his tea as if she wasn't there. That's not surprising. Ever since Mike and Julia got married, we had been regularly reporting on Julia and Mike's behavior, as well as the grandchild's condition. It started with just concern for our daughter with bad behavior, but it seems they finally ran out of patience with a daughter who showed no remorse even after getting married. "Oh, that's right. Julia, sign this, please." What's this? Renunciation of inheritance? Why? Why, you ask? It's obvious. You ran away without paying for the trouble you caused here, and then you caused new troubles, hurt such kind people, and even neglected your child. You are no longer my daughter. Don't ever call me Mom again. Julia turned even paler than when I had spoken to her, utterly rejected. Without any concern for Julia's state, her mother pressed on. "And don't think you might be forgiven after a few years. You and I are strangers from this moment on. We will never meet or talk again." "No, that's a lie. Dad won't say such things, right? Right." Julia clung to her father in a last hope. I had heard before that her father had been lenient with Julia, which is why he had paid the compensation after she ran away the last time. But now her father's gaze was cold. "No, I won't say anything." "Dad!" Julia's face brightened momentarily, but it was soon to crumble with her father's next words. "It's a waste of time to talk like that to a stranger." "What?" Julia's parents did not react to anything she said after that. And when Julia finally gave up and left, they bowed their heads to us. They mentioned damages, but we told them it would be paid by Mike and Julia, and they agreed. Julia's parents say they hired a lawyer to demand that Julia pay back the compensation they covered for her. They hired the lawyer precisely because they wanted to avoid further involvement, and they planned to sell the house and move as soon as they recovered the compensation. While discussing this, Julia and Mike returned to the living room. Unlike at the funeral venue, Mike was oddly assertive this time. Did you know that coercion into renouncing an inheritance can be revoked later? If we say we were threatened, we can still inherit. Too bad for you. Oh, I knew about that. Don't worry. Both we and Julia's parents have decided to donate to charity. So, if something happens to us, all the money goes there, and there will be nothing for you. Mike was speechless, his plan thwarted. Next to him, Julia stood frozen, her face pale. Look, it's strange for outsiders to stay in the house for so long. The rest of your belongings will be taken by a moving company, so please leave quickly. As John said this, Mike tried desperately to say something, but no words seemed to come out. He drooped his shoulders and left the room. Julia glared at me fiercely. Julia, is there something else? Where is my daughter? Give her back. How strange of you to say. The child is now my daughter, not yours. She is my child. You're just planning to take all the allowance, aren't you? Greedy. I sighed at the endless talk about money. Julia flinched at my gesture. I smiled sweetly at Julia and delivered the final blow. Unlike you, I do not need money. It's a pleasure to be able to raise her. Thank you for giving birth to her. Julia let out an inarticulate scream and ran out of the house as if fleeing. After confirming that two had left, I called the housekeeper who had been looking after the grandchild to come back. That night, after Julia's parents left, I was finally able to reminisce and immerse myself in memories of my mother. Later on, Mike and Julia moved into the run-down apartment John had arranged for them. I heard Julia didn't do housework because she couldn't stand bugs, and the house was in disarray. They quickly divorced, but due to a lack of money, they couldn't live separately, and I heard shouting daily. Mike is reportedly working as a construction laborer, but never having worked seriously, he is scolded every day on the job site, while Julia started working at a nightclub. Her youth, once her selling point, was overshadowed by others, and she hardly earned anything. They repeatedly break up and reconcile with different partners, causing a ruckus each time, according to a gossip-loving neighbor. Julia's parents sold their home and moved as planned once they recovered all the money from Julia. Since Julia's father originally worked for a multinational company and her mother was half foreign, they moved abroad. They keep in touch regularly and sent postcards with beautiful scenery. As for me, I've started child rearing from scratch, which is quite hectic every day. However, the grandchild, now my daughter, is very well behaved, so John and I engage in parenting with laughter. John is smitten, allowing her to accompany him to work and even taking her himself. This has led to rapid growth in the company's department that makes children's toys. The company has grown even larger, often featured on television. For my daughter's education, we are also focusing on foreign languages. 3 times a week, we connect with Julia's parents over the phone for a chat and language study. We have plans to stay with Julia's parents next spring. Though every day is busy and challenging, it's fulfilling and happy. As I think about it these days, I want to stay healthy and energetic until my granddaughter grows up, so I'm being more conscious about diet and exercise.